Welcome to this Component 3 World Sociology screencast on globalisation. And we're going to look at three main areas in this presentation. So firstly, we're going to start with a definition of globalisation. And then secondly, we'll briefly look at some of the main causes of globalisation, focusing particularly on the spread of international trade. And in the final part of the presentation, we'll do some evaluation work by looking at perspectives on globalisation and trying to look at whether or not globalisation has been a good or a bad development. Now, it's not easy to define this term globalisation because, to be honest, it's a bit of a slippery buzzword. It's used in lots of different ways to refer to lots of different processes, and arguably it's a term that lacks analytical precision. But as a general definition, I think we can describe globalisation as referring to this growing interconnectedness and integration of individuals, nations and regions of the world, and also our growing awareness of these interconnections. So let's look at some of the main causes of globalisation. And one of the main causes of globalisation is the growth of international trade and the creation of a global economy. And I think we can put this down to three main factors. Firstly, we've seen the development of enormous transnational or multinational corporations that have a global reach and increasing power. So for example, if you take the big American retailer Walmart, it's an enormous transnational corporation. If you look at the annual revenues of Walmart, it's in excess of the gross domestic product of many medium-sized countries. And a second factor that has contributed to growing global economic integration are improvements in travel and shipping, which are now much cheaper and much safer than they ever were in the past. In 1800, it took about 2 months to cross the Atlantic. Today, by plane, it takes maybe 5 or 6 hours and less than a week by ship. And this ability to travel to remote places with greater speed and ease is sometimes referred to as time-space compression. And then the third factor that's been integral to the creation of a global economy has been this practice of trade liberalisation. And this is where governments, often influenced by neoliberal ideology, have tried to create free trade by decreasing or removing tariffs and other trade barriers. So we've seen a move away from economic protectionism and more trade that moves across national boundaries. Of course, international trade is not a wholly new phenomenon. However, proponents of globalisation would argue that what's changed in recent decades is just the sheer scale in world trade. So we can see in this graph that in 1960, international trade accounted for less than 20% of the world's gross domestic product. But by the beginning of the 21st century, we can see that it increased to about 50% of the world's GDP. And of course, another really important cause of growing global interconnectedness have been some of the important developments in IT and media communications. And the sociologist Anthony Giddens has a really horrible term to describe the effect of these technologies. He talks about a process of time, space, distanciation. And what Giddens means by this is that increasingly our social relations are disembedded from local contexts of interaction and rearranged across indefinite spans of time and space. Or to put it in simple terms, it's now possible to be more intimate with somebody on the other side of the world than somebody on the other side of the same room. Okay, the last thing that we're going to do in this presentation is have a look at some perspectives on globalisation and weigh up whether or not globalisation has been a good or a bad development. And the term that we're going to use to describe those perspectives that are positive about globalisation is we're going to call them the hyperglobalisers, or the the global optimists. And as a generalization, most of these people tend to be politically on the right. They tend to be very pro-capitalism, and there's a particularly strong link, I think, with neoliberalism. And those people who've been much more critical about globalization, we're going to call them the skeptics or the global pessimists. And again, as a generalization, these people tend to be more on the political left, linked either to dependency theory or other Marxist perspectives, or some of the people-centered approaches that we've looked at. And I think the starting point for hyperglobalists, those people who are positive about globalization, would be the argument that global capitalism has done a lot of good. So the argument would be that people now are healthier, live a longer life, and are markedly wealthier than they were 30 or 40 years ago. And this applies not just to people in rich countries. Also, if you look at data from the World Bank, it shows that about 600 million people in poorer countries have moved out of extreme poverty over the last 30 years. And this is partly down to manufacturing jobs moving from high-wage countries to low-wage countries, creating more economic opportunities for people in developing countries. And hyperglobalists would argue that economic liberalisation is also often accompanied by a parallel process of political liberalisation. So the argument that they're making here is that another positive feature of globalisation has been the spread of ideas like democracy and individual freedom to different parts of the world, particularly from the end of the 1980s when the Cold War came to an end. And lastly, hyperglobalists are also upbeat and positive about some of the cultural effects of globalisation. So they talk about globalisation creating new, exciting, hybrid or fusion cultures that bring together different cultures, different people from around the world. And we can see that expressed in new forms of food, new forms of music, new forms of art, and so on. Okay, let's now look at those people who are a bit more pessimistic about globalization, the skeptics, who as a generalization tend to be politically a bit more on the left. And one of the main arguments that the skeptics would make, reflecting I think dependency theory, would be the argument that increased trade has had unequal benefits. So it's mainly been these richer countries in the northern hemisphere who benefited, but there are many other parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, that have largely been left behind. And also the skeptics would argue that even those developing countries that have experienced a lot of economic development, that have seen their gross domestic product go up quite significantly, in those countries, that extra wealth that's been produced has not always trickled down to the poorest sections of society. So the argument would be that one of the main problems with global capitalism is it exacerbates inequalities, both between nations, but also importantly within nations. And the global pessimists would also be sceptical of the idea that globalization necessarily leads to more democracy. Noam Chomsky, for instance, argues that globalization has actually seen the erosion of power from elected governments, and by extension the people who vote for them, and that decisions are increasingly made at a global level by elites who are not accountable to the general population. So power is transferred from the nation state to banks, to multinational corporations, to the Bretton Woods institutions. And this is a process that the sociologist George Ritzer has referred to as the McDonaldization of world society. But in my view, the most powerful criticism of globalization comes from environmentalism. As worldwide production and consumption increases, we use more resources, especially more water, more land, more fossil fuels. So globalization may have made the average human richer, but the problem is that rich people tend to use more of everything, especially energy. And so the economic growth that we've recently experienced has been dependent upon unsustainable use of the planet's resources. And from an environmentalist perspective, this can't go on forever. And so environmentalists would argue that globalization in its present form is unsustainable, it's short-sighted, it's self-indulgent and tremendously destructive.